Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final session of today, if I'm not mistaken, the keynote address. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Robert Labaree. Ben ara sıra Türkçe'de konuşayım. Ben şu anda büyük bir onur duygusuyla ve zevk ile bugünkü Davetli konuşmacı sunuyorum. Robert Labaree. Professor Labaree is recently retired, Professor Emeritus from New England Conservatory in Boston, and where he taught ethnomusicology and music history for nearly 40 years, I think. And he's also a performer of makam-based Ottoman Turkish classical music. Professor Labaree 30 yıldan çok 30 seneden daha fazla New England Konservatuvarı'nda hoca olarak çalışmış. Hem etnomüzikoloji hem müzik tarihi hocası olarak ve kendisi aynı zamanda Osmanlı Türk klasik müziklerinde uzmandır. Makam müziği çalıyor. Professor Labaree's, among his accomplishments, he has recorded for Kalan Records, has solo recordings as well as group recordings with the Eurasia Ensemble and with Dünya Ensemble. And he played an important role collaborating with instrument maker Feridun Özgören in reviving the Çeng, an important Ottoman instrument that had fallen out of use. Professor Labaree müzisyen olarak Eurasia Ensemble ve Dünya Ensemble ile birlikte birçok kayıt etmiş Kalan'da diskleri falan var ve Feridun Özgen'in birlikte çalışarak Çeng dediğimiz eski Osmanlı çalgının yeni canlandırmasına önemli bir katkı vermiş ve kendisi çalıyor, çok güzel kalıyor. On a personal note, I will say that I have known Bob for more than 10 years, and I was very honored that when I was just beginning my own studies in ethnomusicology, he very attentively read one of my papers as a young student that I presented at a conference, and gave very thoughtful comments. He and I both have graduated from Wesleyan University. He has a PhD and MA from Wesleyan University. I have an MA in ethnomusicology from Wesleyan University. So we have that in common, and I read his dissertation, which he completed in the early 1980s with great interest. It's about melodic variation, comparing melodic variation in makam-based music and also medieval plain chant and English folk song. And it's very close to some of my own research interests. And Professor Labaree was also very helpful as I was preparing to go to Turkey and do research. He gave me a lot of advice. And as a final comment, I'll just say that he studied music, makam-based music, under Niyazi Sayan and also İhsan Özgen. And as I understand it, the latter is also the topic of his presentation for today, which is titled The New Cemil Bey in America, a Meşk with İhsan Özgen. Bu son cümlede Türkçe de söyleyeyim. Professor Labaree aynı zamanda Türkiye'de Niyazi Sayan Hoca ile ve İhsan Özgen Hoca'yla makam müzikleri okumuş ve ben anladığıma göre İhsan Özgen Hoca hakkında bir sunum verecek bugün. The New Cemil Bey in America, a Meşk with İhsan Özgen isminde bir sunum. And with that, let me hand things over to the esteemed Professor Labaree. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Selamlar herkese. Anne günü bugün. Amerika'da herkes anne günün tebrik ederim herkese. Fakat bir komplike bir gün konferans için aile günü. But welcome to everybody. This is Mother's Day here in the United States. Let me see if I can make sure that we have my screen share show up. And we'll, once that's working. So if Dave will tell me if that's not working.
It looks good, Bob, thanks.
Oh, thank you. This paper, like many others in this conference, begins with Tanbûrî Cemil Bey, but it will not long stay with him. I will move quickly from Cemil to the celebrated multi-instrumentalist İhsan Özgen, who passed away in January at the age of 79. Here pictured in 2018 with his former mentor and colleague, Nezen Niyazi Sayın. The title of Yeni Cemil Bey, or the New Cemil Bey, was given him beginning in the 1990s, after a series of solo concerts featuring his mastery of Cemil's recordings on kemençe, tanbur, lafta, and cello, and his detailed study of Cemil's recorded taksims. Along with Niyazi Sayın, Özgen planted the seeds of makam performance and pedagogy in the growing American school of Turkish music in lessons and performances in Boston and Istanbul in the 1980s and 90s. Özgen and Sayın first visited Boston at the request of the Ebru artist, instrument maker, and Tanburi Feridun Özgören, a school friend of İhsan Özgen. So the path of this paper moves from Tanburi Cemil to Tanburi İhsan, to the Ottoman music diaspora in America, and to Ottoman pedagogy itself. But the path does not end there. Ultimately, we are headed into a reflection on Ottoman makam's place in the current world, but this is a story which will take some time to unwind. I begin here with a simple tribute to İhsan Hoca. The tribute is magnified by a purpose which aligns both of these two giants with the tangled web of musicians, major and minor, which extends well beyond the old and new Cemils as individuals, backward and forward in time. In one sense, this path traces a silsile, the old Arabic word for the chain of transmission from teacher to student that is still current in the Turkish music world. At times, silsile is immediately identifiable in sound, as for example, in the distinctive kemençe style of two of İhsan's students, Neva Özgen, his daughter, and Derya Türkan. But the meaning of silsile, which interests me today, is larger than this and more multi-stranded, and therefore more resistive of summation. It is a chain which leads into the deep pool of collective multi-generational makam experience. Silsile in this larger meaning incorporates Rüşem Ferit Kam, the man İhsan referred to as kemençe usta, but also the senior masters with whom he performed, including Necdet Yaşar and Niyazi Sayın, and the figure of Mesut Cemil, Tanburi Cemil's son, who is a constant point of reference in his conversation. Then there are all of Tanburi Cemil taksims, which İhsan had painstakingly transcribed and learned, much the way the young jazz students at New England Conservatory in Boston continue to memorize the solos of John Coltrane and Charlie Parker. It is this collectivity that is the central message in what I have to say in the next few minutes. More than individual artistry or the historical origins of an alleged American school of Turkish music. If I say that even giants are dwarfed by the tradition which they co-create, I believe I am saying nothing which diminishes either the old Cemil or the new Cemil, or which contradicts how these men saw themselves. The core of what I'm offering today is a single lesson with İhsan Özgen, which took place on February 5th, 1987, in a living room outside of Boston, Massachusetts. But it was no different in style or substance from the lessons with him in Istanbul, except perhaps that Boston offered fewer opportunities for baklava breaks. I believe the lesson's exploratory and free associative method will be recognizable to many here from their own Meşk moments, and the details I have chosen from this segment of the lesson, as well as the makam references on this PowerPoint, are in no way unique. At 40 years distance, I can now say that the apparent unsystematic rambling of this and other Meşks with him and other Turkish teachers have gradually made more sense to me. Not just because I now understand Turkish music a bit better, but because I understand music better. What is more, in my current understanding, 18th and 19th century Meşk culture is more than a kind of boutique, exotic, pre-modern method superseded by music writing, classroom pedagogy, and electronic technology. I now see Meşk merging easily with today's post-literate culture embodied in current science. Today, I will only be able to suggest some of these wider intellectual developments by way of a few examples of musical and non-musical. I believe a few exemplary fragments from this one exchange between teacher and students in the 1980s will be enough to launch us into a consideration of a larger, much larger network of relationships which animate the teacher's attention to minute auditory details, which at the time, of course, were largely inaudible to me. It is makam as a collective enterprise, which is the burden of what follows. The subject of this Meşk is a single song, the şarkı in Hicaz makam and Georgian usul, Niçin bülbül figan eyler, bahar eyyamedir şimdi, attributed to the mid-19th century Istanbul singer and composer Rifat Bey. In this Meşk, the notation of the composition is being scrutinized closely and punctuated by disapproving head wagging and exclamations of, "Oh, yanlış," as was often his habit. This famous multi-instrumentalist used only his voice, working free associatively, pulling other repertoire from memory, and demonstrating makam behavior through vocal taksim. With all the side comments, digressions, and anecdotes edited out, we are left with only 3 minutes out of a 30-minute session on this song. The impression created is of a more fastidious and systematic process through the song than was actually the case. As in other lessons in Istanbul and Boston, the path through this song was wayward, multi-layered, a zigzag of deciding, mind-changing, and spur-of-the-moment associations, revealing a complex web of auditory connections demonstrated with his voice, but not always articulated in words. There are 2 students present, my colleague and the teacher's old friend, Feridun Özgen, playing tambur, and myself singing and playing bandir. In the interest of time, I am here choosing to focus on just a few selected details of pitch. For example, a 10-minute segment in which the teacher fretted disapprovingly over the notation's alignment of text and usul has been omitted, along with a phone call to me from a plumber about a problem at home. First, hear the teacher reading through the whole song. Note that this is out of sequence, since this excerpt comes from about halfway through the lesson. It is the product of a number of stops and starts, corrections, and associations, some of which we will get to hear. The song notation we are using in the lesson with the teacher annotation is lost, but I offer here a current version from, what else, the internet. As pedagogy, the study of this song consisted of exploratory browsing in the undergrowth of the teacher's accumulated auditory experience. The teacher's ear was triggered by particular gestures which lead out from the page to other regions of collective musical experience. The teacher's attention was drawn especially to the treatment of two pitch regions, and not surprisingly, around F and B. Each inflection of these pitches has its own wider implications for his ear. Within the first few minutes of the lesson, even before the sing-through you just heard, he began worrying the treatment of F in measure 5 on Bahar e Ya, which passes through the pentachord D, E, F sharp, G, A. This signals the presence of a rast makam, he says, but no surprise, it's more complicated than that.
Hey, Bob, can I jump in for a second? Have you paused?
Yeah, yes.
I'm wondering if you can share your computer audio. Right now we're getting it just from the microphone on the computer. I think if you unshare and then when you click share screen again, there's a box that opens and you can check a little box that says share computer.
Is it not coming through?
It's coming through, but it's quieter than ideal.
Okay, let me just see if I can do that. So I'm going to unshare and down on mute, go to mute, and so I want.
Just when you hit share screen, just share your screen again, but there's a dialog box that opens, and just wait a second and look at that. And there should be a little checkbox that says share computer sound.
Yes, I see it. Okay, got it. Okay, there we are. Let's see. Sorry about that. Is that, we'll see how this goes now.
Neva'da caz dörtlüsü var. Neva'da bu selik beşlisi olabilir. Yahut rast beşlisi olur.
Now that little lick that he just sang, da da da da da, I thought that he was a taksim of some kind, but no, actually it's not. It was from a song, Bilmiyorum Bana Ne Oldu by Şevki Bey, and he, at the spur of the moment, decides he's going to sing it. Both the Buselik potential and the Rast potential exist side by side in the same stretch from D to A. And a simple inflection of a comma or two can nudge the melody from one to the other. Later in the lesson, and I will not take time to play it, the teacher says the cadence on D with an F natural suggests Humayun makam. Fa yabal, he says. It depends on F. At other places in the song, when the melody pauses on E, the teacher hears the F getting a different treatment. For example, in measure 16, 17 on the syllable mıdır şimdi.
Bu da hani uşak olacak burada.
So the pause on E triggers an F which is neither sharp nor natural, the Ushak tetrachord. Later in the Meşk, in a revisit to the opening of the song, he now decides to treat Figan in measure 3, not as Rast, but as Ushak, as he had done in measure 17. When the teacher sings the passage, hear that. When the teacher sings the passage on Hezar Asa Figan Etme in measure 19, he hears Buhayer Makam on the cadence an A at measure 22. The B here is Ushak Dil. The B here is Ushak Dil Dik Kurdi, lower than the notated backward flat on Etme.
It's still coming in a little low if you can just make sure that source volume is as high as it can be.
Yeah, I've got it all the way up. Not sure what's happening here.
Okay.
He then sings the Araname, the instrumental tag. Excuse me. That was,
Tam Kürdü değil, dik Kürdü. Evet. Dik Kürdü değil, Uşak değil.
he then sings the Araname, the instrumental tag, notated at measure 28 at the end of the song. Aranames are anonymously composed floaters attached to many different songs as a prelude, postlude, or interlude. In the majority of the more than 30 performances of this song you can find on YouTube, the Araname is a prelude, played note for note like this notation. Here, the teacher is clearly singing a different version of this Araname, which he has stored in memory. And so on. So what do we learn from these little short excerpts? That Turkish music is fundamentally vocal? Well, this we know. That Turkish music is, in its notation, is transparent, that is, that we see through the page and play as much what is stored in memory as is on the page? This also we know. That there is a theoretical language of modern Ottoman makam, koma, tetrachord, karar, seir, and so on. I presented these terms to conservatory students in Boston as the proper way to think of Turkish music, and they accepted them immediately as the Turkish equivalent of the Western theory of harmony and scales. These terms, this theory, we already know. But I believe this Meşk tells us more. What about the non-linear way of working here and in other Meşks? What I have been provocatively calling free associative and wayward, which seems to fall outside of an orderly conservatory-style textbook methodology. I suggest that this non-linearity and waywardness are not simply nostalgic traces of quaint pre-modern sensibility. Rather, they are signs of the value given to complexity and to interactivity in the Ottoman sound world. These are qualities which are nothing if not modern. Silsile, the chain, is one strand of connection within the web of oral experience of makam, and it is this web which the teacher was exploring and exposing for the students and for himself. Busilik, Rast, Ushak, Muhayer, Mayun, and so on. All these references to theoretical constructs are also convenient labels for highly sensitive nuances of auditory experience, each of them attached to its own silsile. I'm now leading into a region which could easily exceed the limits of this talk, so I will need to be concise. This larger region, the modernity of Ottoman makam practice that I see revealed in this lesson, is actually integral to my modest tribute to İhsan Özgen, a substantial portion of whose life was devoted to that practice as it was revealed to him by Tanburi Cemil Bey, even though he was born more than a generation after Jamil's death. For the new Cemil, Meşk with the old Cemil was the new Meşk, made possible by audio recordings. A number of contemporary disciplines, most of them non-musical, will help me articulate the modernity that I see in this little lesson. Music, always behind the curve of intellectual developments, is arriving late to a discussion which actually originated several generations ago in biology, computer science, and sociology. Looking out at the array of interdisciplinary developments in 2001, the science historian Philip Kitcher saw an emerging interactionist consensus in cutting-edge research in the sciences and social sciences. What they had in common was a de-emphasis on individual standalone objects of study and an increased emphasis on the defining role of interaction among those objects. In 2014, biologist Scott Gilbert and immunologist Alan Tauber saw a move within biology away from a molecular science toward ecology, the science of interactivity. As Gilbert put it, information is not a matter of essence, but of relation. Coming from the humanities, Donna Haraway put it another way: relationships are the smallest possible pattern for analysis. Similarly, in this Meşk, I have emphasized relationships and de-emphasized standalone items of repertoire. Rifat Bey's Little Şarkı is a platform from which the musician's mind launches into the three-dimensional auditory space of the makam system. This is a point of view which I first encountered in the work of Albert Lord, who beginning in the 1930s studied illiterate Yugoslav peasants who could invent highly formal poetry and melody the length of the Iliad in successive performances before coffee house audiences during the month of Ramadan. The strands of memory and invention which Lord exposed were then inserted into Western musicology by Leo Treitler, who applied this new systemic, interactive, real-time music-making perspective to the written European tradition, calling into question the conventional musicological focus on unique standalone creations and their unique standalone creators. Let me jump now to Deniz Gil, whose recent book, Melancholic Modalities, Affect, Islam, and Turkish Classical Musicians, draws on the philosopher Gilles Deleuze in her reference to the concept of the rhizome, which Deleuze derived from biology. Her use of the term rhizomatic to describe makam transmission matches my own preference for biology as a musical benchmark. My own growing awareness of biological processes is the main reason that the nonlinear behavior of the Turkish makam performance and pedagogy practice now makes more sense to me. Here's a sample of rhizome as a 21st century concept. The first image on the left is a single segment of what is more fully illustrated in the second image of a bamboo rhizome. Each above ground plant appears to be unique and separate, but below ground they are actually inseparable. In each of these images, where is the center of the tangle of connectivity? Where does the tangle begin? Where does it end? The third image is of a microscopic neural network in the human body. And the next is a map of the transmission network of the HIV virus in one county in Missouri. And the last is a symbolic representation of learning pathways, now a popular topic in education circles. In none of these images from recent science is there a center which controls, and there is no straight line. These are all images of Meşk. In the lesson I have just shared with you, from whom was I learning? Surely the teacher was İhsan Özgen. But like the bamboo, there is more below ground than above. And what was I learning? Well, surely Rifat Bey's Şarkı, but the teacher's pulling of threads of Buselikir and Ras there was neither Rifat nor İhsan, but some much larger collective memory of makam experience. When we step back from freestanding teacher and freestanding composition and look at the whole growth, it is the continuity, the tangle of the system, which stands out. My own personal terminology for this rhizomatic reality is polyphonic. The polyphonic sensibility which is required of those who would understand monophonic music. In maqam, the player and listener is always hearing the halo of melodic associations which accompany any melody. This is the ahenk, that is, the harmony of the melody's ecology. No Hijaz melody is ever heard alone. It is rhizomatic, always entwined in a symphony of all the other Hijaz compositions and taqsims we have ever heard. We are now in this age of interactionist consensus more acquainted with connectivity than ever before, and so the Ottoman maqam system can now strike us as quite modern. After the internet and now the COVID pandemic have demonstrated unequivocally that no organism, no computer device, no individual is unconnected or invulnerable, the low-tech connectivity of the Ottoman Meşk, one teacher, one student in a room singing to each other and marking out the dooms and texts of the rhythmic cycle on their knees, is itself in miniature a paradigm which fits our own age. The Ottoman maqam system, with all its seemingly wayward, contradictory, and indirect lines of connection, now strike us as the embodiment of how humans actually live. Ottoman tek seslilik itself, Ottoman monophony, one of the thematic traits of Ottoman backwardness, in the opinion of European travelers over the centuries, stands up within the hyper-modern connectivity of internet and pandemic, no longer as a nostalgic leftover from a superseded civilization. In our growing suspicion of hierarchical forms, we 21st century people are now better positioned to accept Meşk as an icon of the complexity of social interactions, the connectivity of parent and child, of village and parent, of tradition and individual, of internet and device, of nature and human. Meşk is what living things do. Though I didn't know it at the time, all this was being demonstrated to me by my teacher, Yeni Cemil Bey İhsan Özgen, doing what he had done with his teachers, an ongoing müşterek taksim of entwined melodies over a zikir of stories, jokes, chai, meze, and rakı. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for that wonderful presentation. It's it's always strange in the Zoom environment. I was ready for some applause that didn't arrive, but I'm sure everyone is applauding at home.
I'm sorry the sound just didn't come through very well. I don't know what's going on. I found this to be continually a problem.
It's okay. You know, I think that our audience was familiar enough with the music you're talking about that we could all hear quite well what, you know, what the melodic outline was and everything, even if it was a little bit.
I just wanted people to hear İhsan's voice. That's all.
Yeah, great.
It's very like this picture to me is a very moving picture, and the sound of his voice has always been very moving to me in this context.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so we have a few comments from viewers, listeners, and just at the beginning of the talk, Aslihan Eruzun Özel says, a very valuable guest, very valuable meeting. Thank you very much for being here. And our Hoca Professor Ruhi Ayangil says, it's a great pleasure to be here together in the frame of this international symposium with esteemed colleagues, Professor Labaree and with me. And welcome to both of us, Bob. So one question we have, and I also have a question or two, but one question we have is from Orkun Zafer Özgelen, who says, thank you for your presentation, Professor, and asks, as we understand that Turkish maqam music masters understand and teach the maqam music with dörtlü or beşli in the scale, I want to ask, is it understandable to practice maqams in this way? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I get it. I mean, you know, it almost doesn't matter what the construct is that a teacher uses. I've found this over and over. You know, whether it's a fourth or a fifth, these become sort of doctrinaire, and you know, this is the Hijaz tetrachord, and there's the Sabah tetrachord, and so on. And this becomes a kind of method for teaching. But in the end, the fact of the matter is, it enters everybody's vocabulary, and actually it's that vocabulary and that connectivity to real musical experience that I'm interested in, regardless of where it comes from. And so it's kind of like what I've seen in the so-called theory that students learn in conservatories, about the tonic and the dominant, and what major and minor differences are, and what you do when you're descending in the harmonic minor scale, and so on. I mean, these are all kinds of frozen orthodoxies that we end up making of these musical realities. There is a musical reality in them. And what I was interested in the silsile, in the rhizome, and in this tangle of associations, is that here was İhsan Özgen simply following his ear. And we are watching in this sort of untidy fashion about him moving his way through it. And we're watching him make these associations. And the associations happen to be with beşlik and dörtlük. I mean, these are functioning pieces of his thinking. But anybody who knows him would know that he's not a theoretical kind of guy. It's just that those pieces of theory have managed to penetrate to his actual practice. And so, in passing it on to me, a kind of beginner at that point, this was very natural for him to do.
Thank you. That was a really rich answer. I appreciate it. We have one other comment from Sofia Zervas, who you may know is at Harvard, just presented before in the panel before you. Fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. And we are kind of at about the half-hour mark from when we started, but our second keynote speaker is not going to be here, so I feel like we can maybe steal 1 or 2 more minutes, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure.
Because I would like to ask you, I was so glad you brought up Denise Gill's book and the idea of the rhizome in the context of this Meşk study. One of the ideas from that book that I found really provocative was when she talks about Meşk and sort of argues that she had been trying to trace these direct lines of silsiles, like as if individual master-disciple lineages could be perfectly traced, and then found that she couldn't trace them, and concludes that it's kind of this Orientalist project to try to connect these individualistic lines in that way. And I was interested in your presentation. You seem to have a different view, that it's not a function of something being essentially different about the East, that lineage is messy like this, but it's also something in the biosciences and happening all over the world. And so I wondered if you wanted to comment on to what extent do you see this as uniquely Turkish, and to what extent do you see it as a larger phenomenon?
No, I do not see it as uniquely Turkish at all. And this is one of the great sources of hope that I have, that we're coming up with vocabulary internationally about how to actually think about these things. What her doubts about the whole idea of tracing genealogies, like biblical begats, who begat whom. There's been a tendency to do this over the years in both Christian and Muslim civilization for a long time. Who taught whom? It's a way of tracing the tree of transmission. And we all know that in many ways is a very useful thing to do. But what's fascinating to me is that when you see what has happened with genealogical ideas like that, at the heart of that is biology, and biology has completely transformed it. Biology has dropped away from the strict genealogical transmission, as if this gene produces that effect. We now know that's not the way it is. It is not a straight line, as I've said. It is a very curlicued line. It is affected by the context. And that's why I connected with what she was saying. It's true, I could see why she backed away from the Orientalist implications of that, because Europeans have always been saying, we're the orderly ones, everybody else is disorderly. We're the ones that know how to focus. We are rational. We're the ones that know science. The poor Ottomans, they're really smart and they do all these things and they have a pretty amazing civilization, but you know, it's a mess. And after studying for a good decade, as many European travelers accounts as I have, that's now published in Musical Quarterly, you get a very different picture. You get a picture of the very reportage of the Europeans about the Ottomans and their music is at least 50% about the Europeans themselves, which absolutely confirms what we're saying here is the rhizomatic reality. There is the self and other, the subject and the object are being redefined now, and that is a great relief for us all because we have less opportunity to objectify each other.
Well, I love that answer. Thank you so much. We have a number of other speakers also just writing in with thanks and congratulations to you, Professor Kemal Karaosmanoğlu. Thank you for the presentation. Professor Gülçin Yahya Kaçar, Professor Ruhi Ayangil, Sezin Büyük Menekşe. So we have a number of people who've been listening with great attention and interest to your presentation, and I'm sure conversations about it will continue amongst ourselves as a too much on our WhatsApp group and in other contexts. So thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your and taking the time to share also from your experience with İhsan Özgen Hoca. And I should a final comment that has just come in from Yelda Özgen. Dear Robert, wonderful presentation. It means a lot to me. And that seems like an excellent moment to wrap things up, unless you have a quick response.
You're killing me, Yelda.
You're killing me. And also finally, this is another, a couple of viewers commented that the bit about Rakı was a wonderful moment in the presentation and confirmed that it's an important part of the Meşk.
Yes, it significantly was the end.
Yeah. Bob, the questions are just coming in now. I don't know. Do you feel comfortable?
Sure, I'm fine. You're the one with the eye on the clock. I don't know. I don't know where
the clock
we
is
are.
over, but people can sign out, I suppose, if they want to, right? From Peter Salvucci, Dr. Labaree, on the topic of Meşk, how do you feel about authenticity of a composition and creative role of the pupil in the transmission of music to future generations?
Oh boy. That's a question that has the aura behind it of the concerns of Western musicology, because the question of whether a given musician is doing justice to the composition in front of him has been in the foreground, and it's actually dominated the teaching of Western classical music. In many ways, what I'm saying here today is an alternative to that. I feel like the authenticity question goes around and around and around and never comes to rest, precisely because there is no way for it to come to rest. And I feel like the rhizomatic approach, for example, to use Denise's image, is to me a far more accurate way to orient ourselves. If we walk into the playing, the performance, the preparation, the teaching of a given composition, no matter how revered and how many thousand times it's been played, to be able to see it as part of this connection, that there is more below ground than above, that directs our attention in a way that I think we could, that where in the end, authenticity doesn't come up because we're just talking about the music and the way it lives and what it's connected to. So whether we're doing justice to Beethoven, which was an obsession for many generations since the since Beethoven's death in the first quarter of the 19th century. This is, to me, I think we're finally, with the help of biology and other disciplines, we're getting to this notion that what's more important is the relationship. What is more important is the connectivity. What is more important is the network of meanings that are in that piece. That piece triggers those meanings. And it's an interaction. It's an interaction. It is not a, as Scott Gilbert said, it's not an essence. It is a relationship.
I love that. I love that answer, especially in a tradition like Makam, where the music staying alive means constant change, right?
Yeah.
We have another comment from Yelda Özgen. Nevada dinliyor sevgili baba sunumun için çok teşekkür ederim. Neva Özgen. I think Yelda must have passed that message on.
I would hope.
Yeah. Refik Can Tashar, the presentation was very interesting and effective for me. Thank you very much, Professor Labaree. From Cenk Güray, also one of our esteemed colleagues and teachers in Ankara. Thank you, Professor Labaree. Esra Berkman, thank you, Professor Labaree and Dave Fossum. Great session. So we're kind of over time at this point. We have a little freedom to keep chatting, but I think people might be getting tired at the end of a long day. So
yes. It's the beginning of my day and it's the end of yours. So
yeah, exactly. Same here.
So I mean, thank you very much, Dave. I mean, you pull the cord when it's necessary.
Okay, now let's sign off. Let's wrap up and say goodbye to folks.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you for again, Bob, and happy Mother's Day to everybody.
Okay.